The gas was so sharp it seemed to pull all the air from the small, cluttered living room. David's head snapped up from the invoice he was struggling to decipher. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was standing frozen in front of the television, her small body rigid, her finger outstretched and trembling. On the screen, a local news channel was running a puff piece on the city's most talked-about couple, billionaire industrialist Julian Croft and his incandescently beautiful fiancée, Amelia Sterling. The camera zoomed in on Amelia's hand as she waved to a crowd, a magnificent, star-like diamond glittering on her finger. But it wasn't the diamond that held Lily's attention. It was the ring beside it, on her right hand, a delicate antique gold band, intricately carved with forget-me-nots, cradling a single sapphire the color of a twilight sky. It was unique, elegant, and achingly familiar. Lily's breath returned in a ragged, heartbroken cry that tore through David's soul. "Daddy!" she wailed, her voice cracking with a child's absolute certainty. "That's Mommy's ring. That lady is wearing Mommy's ring." David's heart clenched. He rushed to her side, ready to dismiss it, to soothe the phantom pain of memory. But as he looked from his daughter's shattered face to the screen, he saw it. The tiny, almost invisible chip on the edge of the sapphire, the way one of the carved flowers was slightly less defined than the others. It was Sarah's ring. The ring he had slipped from her still, cold hand at the hospital, promising to keep it safe for their daughter forever. The ring that was supposed to be tucked away in the lacquered box at the back of his closet. A cold, terrifying dread washed over him. How could this be possible? The news segment ended, replaced by a garish car commercial, but the image of the ring remained seared into the air between them. Lily was sobbing now, deep, gulping cries that shook her entire frame. David knelt and pulled her into his arms, his own throat tight with a confusing mix of anger and fear. "Shh, baby girl. It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "It just looks like Mommy's ring. There are lots of rings in the world that look the same." But the words felt like ash in his mouth. He had crafted Sarah's wedding band himself, a simple, hammered silver ring, but the sapphire had been her grandmother's, a family heirloom passed down through generations. It was as unique as a fingerprint. "No, Daddy, it is," Lily insisted, pulling back to look at him, her eyes wide and swimming with tears. "I know it. It has the sleepy flower on the side, and the little star chip. You showed me." He had. One rainy afternoon a year ago, when Lily's grief had been a raw, open wound, he'd taken out the lacquered box that held the few precious things he'd kept of Sarah's. He had shown her the ring, let her trace the intricate flowers, and told her the story of how her great-grandfather had bought it for her great-grandmother in a little shop in Paris before the war. He had pointed out the sleepy flower, a petal that drooped slightly more than the others, and the tiny chip, which he'd called a fallen star trapped in the sky of the sapphire. He had made it a fairy tale object, a tangible piece of her mother's magic. Now that magic was being flaunted on the hand of a stranger, a woman who lived in a world of penthouses and private jets, a world so far removed from their tiny 2-bedroom apartment above his struggling carpentry workshop that it might as well have been on another planet. He stood up, his mind racing. He had to be wrong. Lily was a child, and grief played tricks on the memory. He went to his bedroom, his heart pounding against his ribs. The closet smelled faintly of sawdust and Sarah's long-gone perfume. He reached to the back of the top shelf, behind a stack of old sweaters, and felt for the smooth, cool surface of the lacquered box. His fingers found it. For a second, relief flooded through him. He pulled it down, the familiar weight of it, a small comfort. He sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet lining, was Sarah's silver wedding band, a pressed wildflower from their first date, and the single pearl earring he'd found in the hospital bed. But the indented space where the sapphire ring had always rested was empty. The velvet held the ghost of its shape, a void that screamed louder than any alarm. The dread returned, colder and sharper this time. He hadn't just misplaced it. It was gone. And he had no earthly idea how. He had been so careful with it. After Sarah's death, their world had collapsed. Medical bills had piled up into an insurmountable mountain. He'd had to sell his and Sarah's small house, moving them into the apartment above the workshop to save money. He sold furniture, old electronics, anything that wasn't essential. He'd even, in his most desperate moments, sold some of Sarah's less sentimental jewelry, a few necklaces, some bracelets, to a reputable jeweler to keep the lights on and food on the table. But not the ring. Never the ring. He was fiercely, absolutely certain of it. That ring was Lily's birthright, the last piece of a legacy of love. He had packed it himself, whispering a promise to Sarah that he would guard it with his life. So where was it? Could it have been in a box he'd sold by mistake? The thought made him feel sick. He had been a zombie in those days, functioning on autopilot, his mind shrouded in a thick fog of grief. It was possible. A small, overlooked jewelry box, mixed in with a crate of kitchen supplies. It was horrifyingly plausible. He went back to the living room. Lily had cried herself into a state of hiccuping exhaustion, her face buried in the sofa cushions. He sat beside her, the empty lacquered box feeling like a condemnation in his hands. He didn't know what to do. What could he do? March up to the gleaming steel and glass tower of Croft Industries and demand a billionaire's fiancée return a ring? They would laugh him out of the building. They would have him arrested for harassment. He was a nobody, a carpenter, with sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands. They were untouchable. "Daddy," Lily's muffled voice came from the cushions. "We have to get it back. Mommy would be sad if a stranger has her ring." In that moment, watching his daughter fight for the memory of her mother, David felt a shift inside him. The fear and helplessness receded, replaced by a slow-burning ember of determination. He was a nobody, but he was Lily's father and Sarah's husband, and that had to count for something. He didn't have money or power, but he had the truth, and he had to try, for Lily, for Sarah. He pulled his daughter into his lap, her warm, small body a comforting anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "Okay, baby girl," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Okay, we'll try." The next morning, David woke before dawn, the problem churning in his mind. The first step, he reasoned, had to be simple, direct contact. He couldn't storm the castle, but maybe he could knock on the gate. He found the main number for Croft Industries online. The automated system was a labyrinth of extensions and directories. After 10 minutes of navigating menus, he finally reached a human being, a receptionist with a voice so polished and clipped it seemed designed to repel people like him. He explained his situation as calmly and concisely as he could, feeling more foolish with every word. The story of the missing ring, the grieving child, the antique heirloom, it all sounded like a flimsy, desperate fabrication, even to his own ears. "Sir," the receptionist said, her tone dripping with bored condescension, "Mr. Croft's personal affairs are not handled through this office, and Miss Sterling is not an employee of this company. I cannot help you." "Could you please just pass on a message?" David pleaded, his frustration mounting. "It's incredibly important. It's about a family heirloom. If you'd like to submit a business proposal, you can do so through the website," she said, her voice a perfect dead end. "Have a nice day." The line clicked. David stared at the phone, a dial tone buzzing in his ear. He tried again, this time asking for the Public Relations Department. He was transferred to a voicemail. He left a message, carefully laying out the facts, his voice tight with the effort of sounding sane and reasonable. He knew no one would call back. He spent the rest of the day in the workshop. The rhythmic scrape of his plane against a piece of oak, a poor distraction from the chaos in his head. He was crafting a custom bookshelf for a wealthy client, one of the jobs that was barely keeping his business afloat. Every intricate joint, every smooth, sanded surface was a testament to his skill and his honesty. He wasn't a grifter, he was a craftsman, and he would not be dismissed so easily. That evening, he decided on a new approach: a letter. A physical object was harder to ignore than a disembodied voice on a phone. He sat at their small kitchen table while Lily did her homework, a drawing of a smiling sun with a face in it. He wrote carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he used to choose his tools. He told the story of the ring, of Sarah, of Lily. He wasn't accusatory. He framed it as a terrible, bewildering mystery that they needed Ms. Sterling's help to solve. He included a photograph, one of his favorites, taken on their last anniversary. Sarah was laughing, her head thrown back, and on her right hand the sapphire ring was clearly visible, catching the light. He put the letter and the photo in an envelope, addressed it to Julian Croft, and paid for express, tracked delivery. For the next 2 days, he checked the tracking number obsessively. It showed the package was delivered and signed for by someone in the mail room of Croft Tower. And then, nothing. Silence. The ember of determination in his chest began to feel like a fool's hope. Lily, however, was undeterred. She had a child's unwavering faith in fairness. That night, she came to him with a piece of paper. She had drawn the ring from memory. It was a child's drawing, the lines wobbly, the proportions skewed, but the details were astonishingly accurate. She had drawn the band of forget-me-nots, the twilight blue of the sapphire, even the tiny star chip. And then she pointed to the inside of the band in her drawing. She had scribbled a tiny, almost illegible series of letters: S&D forever. David stared at it, his blood running cold. "What's this, sweetie?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the secret message," Lily said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The one you and Mommy carved inside for your forever love. You showed me, remember?" He remembered. On their first anniversary, as a married couple, they had taken the ring to an old jeweler, a man with a magnifying glass permanently attached to his eye, and had him hand-carve the tiny inscription on the inside of the band. It was their secret, a detail so small no one would ever see it, a detail that was impossible to see in any photograph or news report, a detail that only someone who had held the ring, who knew its soul, could possibly know. Lily couldn't have made it up. This was it. This was the proof. The flimsy story was no longer flimsy. It was the undeniable truth. And with that truth came a fresh wave of rage. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. Someone had their ring, Sarah's ring, and they were flaunting it as their own. The feeling of powerlessness returned, but this time it was edged with a righteous fury. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. He called his sister Claire. She was a paralegal, practical, and level-headed, the anchor in his life since Sarah's death. He explained everything, his voice shaking with a mixture of grief and anger. "A letter won't work, Dave," she said gently, after he finished. "People like that. They have firewalls of people. Lawyers, assistants, PR flacks. Your letter probably went straight from the mailroom into a shredder." "So what do I do, Claire? Just give up? Let them keep it?" "No," she said, a new firmness in her voice. "You don't give up. You change the battlefield. You can't fight them on their turf. You have to bring them onto yours." "What turf do I have?" "A dusty workshop and a pile of debt." "You have a story, Dave. A powerful one. A grieving father, a little girl, and a stolen piece of her mother's heart. You have the truth. People care about that." She suggested something that made David's stomach twist with anxiety. Social media. He barely had a presence online, using it only to post pictures of his work for potential clients. The idea of putting his family's private pain on public display felt cheap, exploitative. "You don't have to be dramatic," Claire coached him. "Just be honest. Post the picture of Sarah wearing the ring and a picture of Lily's drawing. Tell the story. Don't accuse anyone of theft. Just say, the ring is a priceless family heirloom, that it disappeared after your wife's passing, and that you were shocked to see a ring that appears identical on Ms. Sterling's hand. Ask for help. Ask for people's advice on how you might get a private moment with her, to simply look at the ring and see if it has the inscription. That's all. You're just a father trying to solve a mystery for his daughter." It felt like a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary, but it was more than he had now. That night, with Lily asleep in her bed, David sat at his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. He wrote a short, simple post. He attached the photo of Sarah, radiant and alive. He attached the photo of Lily's drawing, so full of innocent, heartbreaking detail. He took a deep breath, his finger hovering over the post button. He felt like he was leaping off a cliff. He clicked it. Then he closed the laptop, went to bed, and slept for the first time in days. A deep, exhausted sleep, unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. The first indication that something was happening was a text from Claire at 6 a.m. It just said, "Check your post, now." David fumbled for his laptop, his eyes blurry with sleep. He opened the page. The post had a few dozen shares, mostly from friends and family. But then he noticed the comments. They weren't just from people he knew. Strangers were leaving messages of support. "What a beautiful story. I hope you get it back. That little girl's drawing broke my heart. This is David and Goliath. Go get 'em, David." He scrolled down. The number of shares was climbing. 100, 250, 500. By the time he'd finished making Lily's breakfast, it was over 1,000. A local blogger, a woman who ran a popular city-centric news site called the Urban Chronicle, had shared it with the caption, "A heartbreaking story unfolding right here in our city. Does billionaire Julian Croft's fiancée have a single father's treasured heirloom? Let's help him get an answer." Mother's ring. The hashtag was like gasoline on a fire. The story, with its clear, compelling narrative, of the little guy versus the untouchable elite was irresistible. It spread from the local blog to regional news forums, then to national ones. People were sharing their own stories of lost heirlooms. Amateur sleuths were analyzing the news footage of Amelia Sterling, trying to get a clearer shot of the ring. By noon, your mother's ring was trending nationally. David's phone began to ring incessantly. Reporters from local TV stations, newspapers, even national online magazines. He ignored them all, overwhelmed. He was just a carpenter. He hadn't been prepared for this. He took Lily to the park, trying to create a small bubble of normalcy in the middle of the escalating madness. But even there, he saw a woman on a bench scrolling through her phone and stopping on the picture of Sarah. She looked from the phone to him, her eyes wide with recognition. The feeling of being exposed, of his private grief being turned into public entertainment, was nauseating. But beneath it, a tiny, stubborn seed of hope was sprouting. They couldn't ignore him now. The call came late that afternoon. The number was blocked. When he answered, a man's voice, smooth and professional, spoke. "Am I speaking with David Morrison?" "Yes. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm legal counsel for Mr. Julian Croft. He and Miss Sterling have been made aware of your public allegations." The term allegations made David's jaw clench. "I didn't make any allegations. I asked for help. Be that as it may, your post has caused my clients considerable distress. They are, however, willing to meet with you to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. A car will be at your address tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Please bring the child's drawing with you." "And Mr. Morrison?" "I would strongly advise you to take down the social media post and make no further public comment." The lawyer's tone was a velvet glove over an iron fist. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The next morning, a black town car, so sleek and silent it seemed to absorb the light and sound around it, was waiting outside his workshop. Lily, dressed in her Sunday best, held his hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. She clutched her drawing, now protected in a plastic sleeve. The drive to Croft Tower was a journey into another world. They left their neighborhood of brick buildings and local shops and entered a gleaming forest of steel and glass. The tower itself seemed to pierce the sky, a monument to unimaginable wealth and power. In the elevator, a silent mirrored box that shot them 40 floors up in seconds, David could feel his heart hammering. He felt small, insignificant, a speck of sawdust in a world of polished marble. Arthur Vance met them in the reception area. He was impeccably dressed, his smile thin and without warmth. He led them down a long, white corridor to a conference room with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Julian Croft and Amelia Sterling were already there, sitting at one end of a long, dark wood table. They looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Julian Croft was sharp and severe, in a perfectly tailored suit, his gaze appraising and cold. Amelia Sterling was even more beautiful in person, but her expression was a mask of polite indifference. She didn't look at Lily. "Mr. Morrison," Julian Croft said, his voice as hard and polished as the table between them, "let's not waste each other's time. You've created quite a stir." David placed Lily's drawing on the table. "This isn't about making a stir, Mr. Croft. It's about my wife's ring." Amelia Sterling finally spoke, her voice cool and distant. "The ring I wear was a gift from my fiancée. It was purchased from a highly reputable antique jeweler in Geneva. We have the certificate of authenticity." Arthur Vance slid a glossy folder across the table. Inside was a professionally printed certificate detailing the ring's provenance, its value appraised at a figure that made David's head spin. The jeweler's name was Galerie Dubois. "I'm sure you do," David said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But my daughter's drawing shows a detail you can't see, a personal inscription on the inside of the band." Amelia's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She glanced at Julian, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "An inscription?" Julian Croft leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what does this supposed inscription say?" "S&D forever," David said quietly. Lily, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her small voice clear and strong in the sterile room. "For Sarah and David, my mommy and daddy." A heavy silence filled the room. Amelia Sterling's hand, resting on the table, instinctively curled, covering the ring. David could see a faint flush creep up her neck. Julian Croft's composure didn't crack, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He looked at David, and for the first time, David saw past the billionaire facade to the predator beneath. Croft saw him not as a grieving father, but as a threat to be managed, a problem to be eliminated. "This is absurd," Croft said, his voice low and dangerous. "A pathetic shakedown. How much do you want, Morrison? Name a price. We'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you can make this whole fantasy of yours disappear." The offer was a slap in the face. The casual, arrogant assumption that his love for his wife, his daughter's grief, had a price tag. The rage David had been suppressing ignited. "This isn't about money," he shot back, his voice rising. "My God, do you people understand anything that isn't about money? That ring is my daughter's last connection to her mother. It is priceless. I don't want your money. I just want you to take it off and look inside. If I'm wrong, we'll leave, and you'll never hear from us again. I'll post a public apology. But if I'm right..." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on Amelia. Her mask of indifference had cracked. She looked rattled, her eyes darting between him and her fiancé. She started to pull the ring from her finger, her movements hesitant. "Amelia, don't!" Julian snapped, his voice sharp. He placed a hand over hers. "You don't have to dignify this nonsense." He turned back to David, his face a thunderous mask. "The meeting is over. Arthur will be in touch with your legal counsel. If you don't have one, I suggest you get one. Because if you continue this campaign of harassment, I will use the full extent of my resources to sue you for defamation, for libel, for everything you have and everything you will ever have. Are we clear?" The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. David knew it wasn't an idle one. This man could crush him, bury him in legal fees until he lost his workshop, his apartment, everything. He had flown too close to the sun, and now he was going to get burned. He picked up Lily's drawing, took her hand, and walked out of the room without another word. As the elevator descended, he looked at his daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. He had failed her. He had picked a fight he couldn't possibly win, and in doing so, had made everything so much worse. The hope that had bloomed just that morning had withered into dust. They rode home in a silence thick with defeat. The sleek black car that had felt like a chariot to a showdown now felt like a hearse carrying his last hopes. Back in the apartment, David made them lunch, the simple act of spreading peanut butter on bread feeling monumental. Lily barely touched her food. Are they bad people, Daddy? She asked, her small voice trembling. David looked at his daughter, at the innocent, trusting face that he had now dragged into a world of cynical power plays and legal threats. He didn't know how to answer. Were they bad? Or were they just so insulated by their wealth that things like sentiment and memory had ceased to have meaning? I don't know, sweetie, he said, the honesty aching in his throat. I think they're just used to getting what they want. He spent the afternoon making calls, leaving messages for pro bono legal aid societies. But the story was too high profile, too messy. No one wanted to go up against the legal team of Julian Croft. By evening, a formal-looking letter arrived by courier. It was from Arthur Vance, a cease and desist order, filled with dense legal jargon that all boiled down to one simple message: shut up or be destroyed. The letter also contained a formal offer: $50,000 in exchange for his silence and a full retraction of his claims. The money was a lifeline. It would pay off his debts, give him a cushion, allow him to take on projects he loved instead of just the ones that paid the bills. It could give Lily a better, more secure life. All he had to do was give up. All he had to do was betray Sarah's memory and tell his daughter her own heart was a liar. He crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. He couldn't do it. He would rather lose everything than sell that part of his soul. Defeated and exhausted, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the glossy folder from the meeting. He'd brought it home without thinking. He opened it and looked again at the certificate of authenticity for the ring. Galerie du Bois, Geneva. It looked official, impressive, but something about it felt off. He was a craftsman. He worked with his hands. He appreciated authenticity. And this document, with its perfect, laser-printed script and generic-looking seal, felt hollow. It felt like a prop. On a whim, driven by a flicker of his earlier defiance, he typed Galerie du Bois, Geneva, into his laptop's search engine. The results were strange. There was no official website for a high-end jeweler. There were a few mentions in old society columns from decades ago, but nothing recent. It was almost as if the gallery didn't exist anymore. He kept digging, falling down a rabbit hole of online archives and forums for antique jewelry collectors. He found a post from 5 years ago on a small, obscure forum. A collector was asking if anyone had ever dealt with Galerie du Bois, mentioning that the business had reportedly closed its doors over 20 years ago after the owner's death. 20 years. Julian Croft had told Amelia he bought the ring for her just 2 years ago. The lie was so blatant, so arrogant. Croft hadn't even bothered to create a plausible fiction. He had assumed no one would ever look closely enough to question it. Why? Why lie about where he got it? If he had bought it legitimately, why invent a fake history? The question gnawed at David. There was a piece of the puzzle missing. He went back to the beginning, to the moment the ring had disappeared. He had sold some of Sarah's things, yes, but he had been so careful. He tried to reconstruct the fog of those weeks after her death. The boxes, the packing tape, the endless, heartbreaking task of sorting through a life cut short. And then a memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharpening into painful focus. Sarah had been a quiet supporter of a local women's shelter, the Beacon House. A few months before she got sick, her own mother had passed away, leaving Sarah with a collection of costume jewelry, gaudy brooches and chunky necklaces she would never wear. Rather than sell them, Sarah had boxed them up to donate to the shelter, for the women there to use for job interviews. "A little bit of sparkle," she'd said, "can make you feel stronger than you are." David remembered the box. It was a sturdy cardboard box from a local department store. He remembered seeing it in the closet. In the chaos of the move, in his grief-stricken state, had he confused the boxes? Had he accidentally donated the box containing Sarah's most precious heirloom, along with the costume jewelry? The thought was a physical blow. It was his fault, his carelessness. It wasn't malice or theft that had taken the ring from them, but his own failure. The guilt was suffocating. But it also provided a new path. It didn't explain how the ring got from a local charity donation box to Amelia Sterling's hand, but it was a start. The next morning, he went to Beacon House. It was a modest building on a quiet street, a world away from Croft Tower. The director, a warm, tired-looking woman named Maria, listened to his story with a patient, compassionate ear. "We get so many donations, Mr. Morrison," she said gently. "It would be impossible to track one specific box from years ago." David's shoulders slumped. It was another dead end. "But," she continued, seeing his disappointment, "we did have an incident around that time. A break-in. It was mostly petty theft. They took a television, some electronics from the office, and they ransacked our donation sorting room. A few bags and boxes were taken. The police investigated, but nothing ever came of it." A break-in. The pieces began to click into place, forming a dark, ugly picture. The donation box, stolen from a women's shelter. The thief, likely a petty criminal, looking for anything of value, discarding the costume jewelry and finding the one priceless item tucked away. And a petty thief wouldn't go to a high-end jeweler. They would go to the quickest, easiest source of cash they could find. A pawn shop. It was a sordid, desperate trail. And at the end of it was Julian Croft. Why would a billionaire be shopping in a pawn shop? It made no sense. Unless he wasn't a billionaire then. David remembered the news articles about the couple. Croft had been successful, yes, but his meteoric rise to the top of the industrial world had been relatively recent, the result of a few ruthless but brilliant business deals over the last couple of years. 2 years ago, when he'd met Amelia, he was just another wealthy man, not the titan he was today. A wealthy, but perhaps insecure man, trying to impress a beautiful woman. A man who might buy a stunning, unique ring from a pawn shop for a fraction of its value, and then invent a grander story to match his ambitions. It was all speculation, a house of cards built on grief and desperation. But it was the only theory that fit all the facts. The fake certificate, the lie about the jeweler, the legal threats. It was all the behavior of a man with a dirty secret, a man trying to bury the humble, tainted origins of a symbol of his love. The knowledge was a heavy weight. He now understood the how and the why. But it didn't bring him any closer to getting the ring back. In fact, it made his position even more dangerous. He wasn't just accusing them of having his ring. He was threatening to expose the lie at the foundation of their perfect, curated love story. He was no longer just a nuisance. He was a liability. And Julian Croft was a man who knew how to eliminate liabilities. The media storm, which had quieted after the news of the private meeting, reignited with a vengeance. Leaks from inside Croft's camp painted David as a failed extortionist. Anonymous sources claimed he had demanded an exorbitant sum of money, and that the social media campaign was a calculated ploy. His character was being systematically assassinated in the court of public opinion. Friends started looking at him with pity and a hint of doubt. The comments on the original post turned vicious, accusing him of exploiting his daughter's grief for a payday. Every time the phone rang, his stomach clenched, expecting it to be another reporter or, worse, Arthur Vance with a lawsuit. The pressure was immense, an invisible vice squeezing him from all sides. He felt himself starting to break. Maybe he should just give up. Sign the NDA, take the money, and disappear. But then he would look at Lily. She had grown quiet, her natural, bubbly effervescence dimmed. She had stopped asking about the ring, but he would find her looking at the picture of her mother, her expression a heartbreaking mix of longing and resignation. She was losing faith, not just in getting the ring back, but in him. That was a price he was unwilling to pay. He had one last card to play, one final, desperate move. He called the only reporter who had seemed even remotely sympathetic, a young woman from the Urban Chronicle blog named Sarah. The same name as his wife, a coincidence that felt like a small sign from the universe. He agreed to an interview, his only one, on the condition that she tell the full story, including his theory about the donation and the pawn shop. He knew it was a risk. He was publicly accusing Julian Croft of lying and covering up the ring's true origin. He was practically daring the man to sue him. The interview took place in his workshop. He wanted them to see him in his element, surrounded by the honest work of his hands. He spoke quietly, simply, laying out the timeline of events, from Lily's cry in front of the TV to his discovery at the women's shelter. He showed the reporter Lily's drawing, the crumpled cease and desist letter, the $50,000 offer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The facts, laid bare, spoke for themselves. The article went live the next day. It was a masterful piece of journalism, weaving together the emotional story of a father's love with the investigative details of David's search for the truth. It presented his theory not as an accusation, but as a series of troubling, unanswered questions. Why did a non-existent gallery issue a certificate? Why would a billionaire threaten a grieving father? The story, titled The Carpenter, the Billionaire, and the Ring of Truth, exploded online. It cut through the noise and the spin, and recentered the narrative on the fundamental questions of truth and decency. Ring of Truth started trending, even bigger than the first hashtag. The public tide turned decisively back in his favor. People weren't just sympathetic anymore. They were angry on his behalf. This time, the pressure was directed squarely at Julian Croft and Amelia Sterling. The story was no longer about them. It was about Sarah. Meanwhile, inside the pristine, soundproofed penthouse overlooking the city, Amelia Sterling was feeling a pressure of her own. The public scrutiny was one thing, but it was David Morrison's story, the details of it that had burrowed under her skin. She had come from nothing. Her childhood had been a landscape of eviction notices and thrift store clothes. She knew what it was like to cherish a single, beautiful object, not for its monetary value, but for the story it held. The ring from Julian had been the ultimate symbol of her escape. It was proof that she was no longer that girl. Its supposed history, its European provenance, had been part of its magic. To her, it was a fairy tale come true. But now the fairy tale was beginning to feel like a lie. Lily's drawing haunted her, and the inscription, S&D forever. She had never looked for an inscription. She had been so dazzled by the ring's beauty, so caught up in what it represented, that she had never thought to look deeper. That night, after Julian was asleep, she went into her dressing room, the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. She took off the ring and held it under the bright light of her vanity mirror. She angled it, her heart pounding. And there, so tiny it was almost invisible to the naked eye, were the scratches. A delicate hand-carved script. S&D forever. The breath left her body in a rush. It was true, all of it. The little girl, the grieving husband, the stolen heirloom. She was wearing a piece of a dead woman's soul. The shame was a physical, sickening wave. She looked at her reflection, at the beautiful, pampered woman staring back at her, and felt a profound self-loathing. Who had she become? She thought about Julian. His denials had been so vehement, his anger so convincing. He had to have known. The fake certificate, the lies, the threats. It was all a desperate, ugly cover-up. He hadn't just lied to David Morrison, he had lied to her. He had built the foundation of their relationship on a deception. The ring, once a symbol of her secure future, now felt like a lie shackled to her finger. The next morning, she confronted him. She laid the Urban Chronicle article out on the breakfast table and placed the ring on top of it. "It's there, Julian," she said, her voice quiet and shaking. "The inscription. It's real." Julian looked at the ring, then at her face. For a moment, the mask of corporate power fell away, and she saw the man she'd first met. Ambitious, yes, but also insecure, desperate to be seen as more than he was. He finally broke. He told her everything. How he'd bought the ring in a dingy pawn shop in a part of town he would never usually visit. How he hadn't had the money for a ring from a famous jeweler back then, but had wanted to give her something magnificent, something that felt like it had history. So he invented one. The story of Galerie Dubois, the forged certificate. It was all his creation, a fantasy he'd spun to cover his own insecurity. "I was going to tell you one day," he said, his voice pleading, "when we were married, when we were secure. It was a stupid lie, Amelia, but it came from a good place. I did it for you." "You didn't do it for me," she said, the cold, hard truth of it crystallizing in her heart. "You did it for you. You lied to me. And you were going to destroy that man, that little girl, to protect your lie." The gulf that had opened between them felt vast, unbridgeable. She knew what she had to do. It was the only decent, human thing left to do. She picked up the ring, her decision made. It wasn't her fairy tale to live. That afternoon, without telling Julian, Amelia drove to David Morrison's workshop. She didn't come in a chauffeured town car, but in her own small coupe. She didn't wear a designer suit, but simple jeans and a sweater. When David opened the door to his apartment, he saw not a billionaire's fiancée, but a woman with sorrow and shame in her eyes. Lily was standing behind him, peeking around his legs. Amelia knelt, so she was at eye level with the child. She held out her hand, the sapphire ring resting in her palm, glowing softly in the afternoon light. "I believe this belongs to you," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry for the pain for our actions have caused your family." Lily looked at the ring, then at her father, her eyes asking for permission. David nodded, his own throat tight. Lily stepped forward and gently took the ring. Her small fingers closed around it. A look of pure, unadulterated joy spreading across her face. She turned to David, her eyes shining. "Mommy's home, Daddy," she whispered. Amelia watched them, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the quiet dignity of a father's love, she felt the hollowness inside her begin to fill, not with the thrill of wealth or status, but with the profound, aching grace of doing the right thing. The ring was back where it belonged, but the story, she knew, was far from over. The return of the ring was not the simple, happy ending David had envisioned. Holding it in his hand again felt surreal, the culmination of a fight he never thought he could win. Lily wanted to wear it, but her fingers were too small, so they placed it back in its rightful spot in the lacquered box, its presence a warm, comforting weight. Amelia had left quickly after returning it, her apology hanging in the air, sincere and deeply felt. But her departure left a vacuum filled with unanswered questions. What would happen now? What about Julian Croft? The next day, Croft issued a public statement. It was a masterclass in corporate damage control. He admitted to purchasing the ring from a non-traditional vendor and to creating a flattering but ultimately misleading history for it as a romantic gesture. He framed it as a mistake, born of love and insecurity, not malice. He offered a public apology to the Morrison family for the misunderstanding and the overzealous actions of his legal team. He also announced a $1 million donation to the Beacon House Women's Shelter in Sarah Morrison's name. It was a calculated, brilliant move. It painted him as a flawed but ultimately repentant man, defanged the media narrative, and effectively bought him public forgiveness. David watched the press conference on TV, a bitter taste in his mouth. Croft was spinning the story, controlling it, just as he had controlled everything else. There was no real admission of the cruelty, of the threats, of the attempt to buy their silence. But as he looked at Lily, who was sitting on the floor, humming to herself as she played with her toys, a sense of peace settled over him. He had what mattered. He had the ring. He had his integrity. He had his daughter's faith in him restored. Let Croft have his narrative. They had the truth. A few days later, a package arrived. It was a large, flat box. Inside was an elegantly framed photograph of Amelia Sterling's hand wearing the sapphire ring. It was a beautiful, artistic shot. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a small handwritten note. "Mr. Morrison, Lily," it began, "no apology can undo the hurt I've caused. That ring was a symbol for me, but I now understand it was the wrong symbol. It represented a life I thought I wanted, one built on illusion. Giving it back was the first real thing I've done in a long time. I have ended my engagement to Julian. I cannot build a life on a foundation of lies. I will be leaving the city to figure out who I am without the money and the glamour. Thank you for showing me what is real. I hope you won't mind the photograph. For a short time, I was part of its story, and I would like to remember the lesson it taught me. Sincerely, Amelia." David read the letter twice, a profound sadness and respect for the woman blooming in his chest. She had lost her fairy tale, but she had found herself. He showed the letter to Lily, explaining it in simple terms. "The lady was sad, Daddy. The ring didn't make her happy," Lily said with a child's simple wisdom. "It's not a happy ring. It's a love ring." The sentiment was so pure, so true, that it brought tears to David's eyes. He hugged his daughter tightly. "You're right, baby girl. It's a love ring." In the weeks that followed, their lives slowly returned to a strange new version of normal. The media attention faded. replaced by new scandals and stories. But the ripple effects of their fight remained. David's workshop was suddenly inundated with orders. People, it turned out, wanted to buy bookshelves and tables from the carpenter from the news. They were drawn to the story, to the idea of a craftsman who stood for integrity and truth. For the first time in years, David was not just surviving, he was thriving. He could hire an assistant. He could take a weekend off. He could afford to take Lily to the zoo. But the biggest change was in him. The fight had reawakened a part of himself he thought had died with Sarah. He was no longer just a grieving husband, a struggling father. He was a man who had faced down a giant and won, not with power or money, but with the simple, unshakable force of his love for his family. He felt alive again. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year later, another package arrived. It was small and elegantly wrapped. There was no return address, but David recognized the handwriting on the tag. It was from Amelia. He and Lily opened it together. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a silver locket, simple and beautiful. He opened it. On one side was a tiny, perfectly rendered engraving of the sapphire ring. On the other side, there was another inscription. It didn't say S&D forever. It said Lily. Tucked beneath the locket was another note. "I found a little town by the ocean," it read. "I'm working in a library. It's quiet. I'm happy. I saw this and thought of you. Every story has more than one chapter. This is for Lily's. All my best, Amelia." Lily let David put the locket around her neck. She held it in her hand, her thumb stroking the engraving of the ring. The ring itself was safe in its box, a memory of the past, a legacy for the future. But the locket was for now. It was a symbol, not of loss, but of connection, of a strange and unexpected friendship forged in a fight for the truth. It was a reminder that even in a world of power and lies, the simplest things, a father's love, a daughter's faith, a stranger's quiet act of courage, could change everything. David looked out the window of his workshop, at the city that had once seemed so intimidating. It didn't look so big anymore. He put his arm around his daughter, pulling her close. They were going to be okay. They had each other. They had their story. And they knew, with an unshakable certainty, the true value of things that could never be bought or sold. Their love was their heirloom, and it was the most precious thing in the world. Perhaps you, too, have a story of a connection that transcended barriers, or an object that holds a universe of meaning. These are the stories that shape us, the quiet battles for love and memory that define our lives. We invite you to share them, to celebrate the truth that the most powerful force on earth is not wealth or influence, but the simple, enduring strength of the human heart.